A fork, a victim, and too many questions. This mystery won't solve itself. Welcome to WordScript Den. I am your host, Denora. This community keeps growing. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your voices make this adventure richer. Let's begin. It was one of those afternoons when the brownstone was at its most predictable. Wolfe upstairs with his orchids. Fritz downstairs prepping something that involved more cream than a Jersey dairy. And me at my desk, contemplating the sort of paperwork that doesn't pay in satisfaction. The quiet was broken not by the phone but by a knock at the door. That in itself wasn't remarkable. What was remarkable was the package in the visitor's hands. A flat, square box wrapped neatly, as if it contained cufflinks or a cheese sampler. The visitor was a woman, early 30s, dark hair pulled into a knot so tight it looked like it was holding her upright. Her face was pale, but her eyes, grey and sharp, could have cut glass. She didn't wait for me to introduce myself. "You're Archie Goodwin. I need Mr. Wolfe now." Now was a tall order. Wolfe doesn't respond to immediacy. He responds to meals, orchid schedules, and occasionally, my persistent nagging. Still, something about her tone told me she wasn't used to being told to take a number. "What's in the box?" I asked, because when someone shows up at our door with gift wrapping, there's usually a string attached. She stepped inside, past me, as if the brownstone had been expecting her. "Evidence," she said flatly. Then she added, "or bait." That earned her a raised eyebrow from me. "I don't mind bait, provided I'm not the one being used for the hook." She set the box down on my desk, undid the string with fingers that didn't shake, and flipped the lid. Inside, nestled on tissue paper like it was a Fabergé egg, lay a dinner fork. The kind you'd expect to see at a respectable restaurant, except this one had a dark, ugly smear along the tines. You didn't need to be a lab technician to identify it as blood. "I want Wolfe to tell me," she said, "who used this fork to stab a man I once trusted." I glanced toward the door to the plant rooms. Wolfe, in all likelihood, was murmuring sweet nothings to a cymbidium. He wouldn't appreciate being summoned down for a cutlery crime scene, not without some bait of his own. Fee, food, or philosophical curiosity? "You'll need to do better than show and stab," I told her. "Forks get around, so do lies. What's the story?" She hesitated, as though compressing a history into a single breath. "The fork was stolen from my table. The man who was stabbed lived, barely, but the one who wielded it—" She looked around the room as though Wolfe himself might materialize. "Is someone I need unmasked before they strike again." The fork gleamed under the light, cold and ordinary, except for that stubborn stain. A domestic utensil turned weapon, brought into Wolfe's sanctum like a trespassing signal flare. I knew then the brownstone's quiet had just been disturbed. "Would you like me to continue with Section 2? The brownstone disturbed, where Wolfe enters the scene and reacts to the fork and its implications. I leaned back in my chair and gave the fork another glance, then her. She had the stance of someone used to tension, back straight, shoulders held in a way that suggested she'd endured enough arguments to treat one more like morning coffee. I could have sent her packing with a polite "try the precinct," but I've been with Wolfe long enough to recognize when an ordinary object has marched itself across the line into Wolfe's territory. A bloody fork delivered in a ribboned box didn't just knock, it kicked down the brownstone door in its own quiet way. "You'll have to give me your name," I told her. Because Wolfe isn't fond of mysteries that start with anonymity. He likes his puzzles in parts, not clouds. "Clara Vardis," she said. "I was an assistant curator at the Calder Museum." "Was?" "I resigned last month. Or rather, I was encouraged to resign. That was already something. Museum types don't usually wander around town delivering cutlery samples dipped in hemoglobin. And if they did, they'd probably put them in glass cases with explanatory labels. "Wait here," I said, picking up the box, careful to hold it from the bottom. If it was bait, I wasn't keen on leaving fingerprints in the cheese. "I'll see if His Majesty can spare a word between orchids." Up the stairs I went, box in hand, preparing my pitch. Wolfe was in his yellow silk robe, pruning shears delicately poised like a scepter, his bulk bent toward a bloom that probably cost more than a used car. He looked up at me, eyebrows collapsing into one another. "You enter with a face that proclaims intrusion," he said. "Close," I answered. "A woman, with a fork, blood on it. Says she wants you to tell her who did the stabbing." He grimaced as though I'd just suggested we substitute canned beans for Fritz's cassoulet. "Archie, what have I told you about interruptions during the 4 to 6 session? That if I do it without cause, you'll reduce my salary." But this isn't without cause. It's not every day someone gift-wraps silverware with a smear of type O. Bah! He set down the shears, a reluctant monarch interrupted by a messenger who might be bearing plague or treasure. A fork? How plebeian? Plebeian or not, she's downstairs, name of Clara Vardis. Former assistant curator, Calder Museum. Said the fork was stolen from her table and later used to poke holes in someone she knew. The victim's alive, but she's convinced the assailant will try again. That got him. Wolfe doesn't like repetition, not in meals, not in crimes. His lips pressed together, and after a beat he heaved himself upright. Bring her up. By the time I escorted Clara into the office, Wolfe had ensconced himself in the red leather chair, the massive desk between them like a judge's bench. He gestured with a finger no larger than a bratwurst, indicating the client chair. She sat, her eyes darting once to the rows of books, then to Wolfe himself, who hadn't spared her more than a glance. "You are Clara Vardis," Wolfe said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, you bring me a fork, sullied." Her throat worked. "Yes, explain," she did in careful sentences. The fork had been part of a set, antique silver, part of her mother's collection. A dinner at her apartment 3 weeks ago. 4 guests, including a man named Leonard Ashe. 2 nights later, Leonard Ashe was found in his study with the fork driven into his shoulder, inches from his neck. He lived, but the wound was deliberate. The fork was missing from her table until it reappeared, mailed to her anonymously in the very box she brought us. No note, no return address. Wolfe closed his eyes. 4 guests. Their names. Their names. Leonard Ashe, of course. Madeline Shaw, who worked with me at the museum. Vincent Yarrow, a benefactor and collector. And a man named Charles Lentz, a restorer. We had gathered to discuss a recent acquisition at the museum, a Byzantine chalice. That was the official reason. Unofficially, she stopped, glanced at me, then back at Wolfe. There were undercurrents, rivalries. Ashe was abrasive. He often treated the rest of us as incompetents. Wolfe opened his eyes, which settled on her with the weight of a cathedral door. "And you seek what? My intervention? Why not the police?" She clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. "The police know Ashe has enemies. They've questioned us all, but they've reached no conclusion. They suspect a burglary gone wrong. That's nonsense. Whoever stabbed him wanted him alive but humiliated. Someone used my fork to make it personal. I want the truth. Before another utensil finds its mark," Wolfe grunted. He shifted, which for him is as good as a drum roll. "You presume too much. Truth is not a commodity for hasty acquisition." She leaned forward, voice tight. "Mr. Wolfe, I'll pay your fee, but you must see someone is circling. Leonard Ashe survived once. He may not again. And if my fork was used once, the implication falls on me. I am already tainted." I had to admit she'd played the card well. Wolfe detests the sullying of reputations, almost as much as he detests leaving his chair. He flicked his eyes toward me. "Archie, retrieve the fork." I handed it over, box and all. Wolfe peered at it as though it were a failed souffle. He didn't touch the tines, only regarded the smear, then set it aside as if its very presence was offensive. "Very well," he said at last. "I will consider. Meanwhile, Miss Vardis, you will leave the fork here. Archie will obtain particulars regarding your dinner companions. You will provide addresses, occupations, and any correspondence relevant. Do so before you depart." She exhaled, relief mixing with tension. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe." He lifted a finger. "I have not accepted. I have agreed to examine." When she had gone, leaving behind a neat envelope of names, addresses, and scribbled notes, Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled. "Archie, the fork is nothing. A trifle. The significance lies in its transformation. Utensils are meant for nourishment, not assault. The inversion speaks." "Yeah," I said. "It says someone skipped finishing school. For you are willfully dense. Whoever wielded it sought to degrade, not destroy. It was not a knife, not a gun, but a fork. That distinction is deliberate." "Okay," I said. "So where do we start?" "With people. Always people. The fork is the key, but keys are useless without locks. These 4 will serve. You will see them. Got it? Do you want Saul on this?" "Not yet. First reconnaissance. Speak with Ashe. Then the others. Extract contradictions. Present them to me, while you sit here in your chair. Of course. Where else?" I grinned because that was the closest Wolfe came to admitting enjoyment. I gathered the papers, already planning the first call. Clara's neat handwriting listed Leonard Ash's address on East 67th, wealthy neighborhood. If he'd taken a fork to the shoulder and survived, he'd probably be reclining there grousing. Before heading out, I checked back with Wolfe. He had already summoned Fritz for beer and was eyeing the fork as though it were a rude guest overstaying its welcome. "Archie," he said. "Without looking up, observe carefully. Not the wounds, but the words. What people choose to conceal will betray them faster than their knives." "Or forks," I said. "Indeed, and that was my cue." With the fork boxed in Wolfe's office like a prisoner awaiting trial, and Clara Vardis's plea still hanging in the air, I stepped out into the evening to see what kind of people turned dinner into attempted murder. It was pushing 7 when I reached East 67th, the kind of evening that makes the city look polished from a distance, but up close still smells like last week's garbage. Leonard Ash's building was limestone with a doorman who sized me up like I was auditioning for a role I didn't fit. He didn't like the cut of my suit, or maybe just the look on my face. But after I gave him my name and said I was there at Ash's invitation, true enough once Wolfe sends me anywhere, he phoned up and got a nod. The elevator ride was smooth, the carpet thicker than Fritz's goulash. When the door opened, Ash was already standing there, arm in a sling, looking about as hospitable as a tax collector. He was in his late 40s, with a head of hair that had chosen retreat but refused surrender. His mouth had that permanent downturn you get when life has handed you every advantage but not enough applause. "So," he said, eyeing me, "you're Wolfe's errand boy." "I've been called worse," I answered. "You mind if I come in before you deliver your opening insult?" He stepped back grudgingly and I entered. The apartment was modern, glass, chrome, the kind of art that makes you feel you're missing the joke. A decanter of brandy sat on a low table, half empty. He gestured at a chair, but his posture made it clear the brandy wasn't for sharing. "I suppose Clara Vardis sent you," he said. "She introduced the fork," I said, sitting down. I figured it only fair to meet the man who got acquainted with it up close. His lips curled. A grotesque joke. Someone wanted to make a spectacle of me. "You think I don't know? I think you know plenty," I said. "Question is, how much you're willing to tell me. Who had reason to stick it to you, literally?" He leaned forward, his good hand gripping the decanter. "Take your pick. Madeline Shaw resents that I bypassed her recommendations at the museum. Vincent Yarrow resents that I called him a dilettante with a checkbook. Charles Lentz resents that I told him restorers are parasites living off true talent. And Clara—" He stopped himself, eyes narrowing. "Go on," I said. "Clara is clever. Too clever. She thinks her resignation was voluntary." "It wasn't. I had a hand in that. She lacked the steel for the position." "That's one way to put it," I said. "Another way is you enjoyed humiliating people. Enough that one of them decided to serve your just desserts with silver tines." He smirked. "If someone meant to kill me, they'd have used something sharper." The fork was symbolic, a statement. I nodded slowly. "That's exactly what Wolfe said. Funny, you two should be on the same page." His eyes flickered, but only for a moment. He poured himself a brandy and ignored the glass, sipping from the decanter like a man who didn't care what anyone thought. "You'll tell Wolfe," he said. "Tell him they all had reason. But if he's half as brilliant as his reputation suggests, he'll see what I see. The fork was chosen for me. Only for me. Because I consume, Mr. Goodwin. I devour reputations, egos, and careers. The fork was poetic justice. Poetry's not my department," I said, standing. "But I'll pass the verse along." He didn't offer a handshake, and I didn't wait for one. Back on the street, I chewed on his words. He was a man who thrived on making enemies, which meant my next stops would be crowded with motives. Still, his emphasis on symbolism was too pat, almost rehearsed. Either he was setting the stage, or he'd already figured out which of his guests had the flair for dramatic irony. Madeline Shaw was next on Clara's list, and her address wasn't far. She lived in a brownstone that had seen better decades, but wore its age with stubborn pride. She answered herself in a paint-smeared blouse, hair tied back, the kind of woman who looked like she'd been fighting canvases all day and winning. "Archie Goodwin," I introduced myself. "I'm working for Nero Wolfe." Her eyebrows lifted, skeptical but intrigued. I didn't realize Clara had the means for Wolfe's fees. She found the means. "Can I come in?" She let me, wiping her hands on a rag as we moved into a cluttered living room that doubled as a studio. Canvases leaned against walls. Brushes bristled from jars, and a smell of turpentine lingered like a permanent tenant. You were at Clara's dinner 3 weeks ago, I began. Same one where the fork later made its career move. Her mouth tightened. I've already spoken to the police. They believe it was a botched robbery. I told them that was idiotic. Wolfe agrees. So do I. What's your take? She moved to the window, looking out as if the street might have answers. Leonard Ashe is unbearable. He thrives on belittlement. That night he dismissed Vincent's collection as trinkets bought with money he didn't earn. He called Charles a brush-wielding janitor. And me? He said my work was a pastiche of real artists. Clara tried to intervene, but he sneered at her too. Sounds like he was handing out reasons for someone to sharpen their cutlery. She turned back, her eyes bright with resentment. Reasons, yes, but not means. I didn't stab him, Mr. Goodwin. I wouldn't risk prison for a man not worth the paint on my floor. Did you notice anything off that night? I asked, her brow furrowed. Charles was restless, fidgeting. He excused himself twice. Vincent drank more than usual, silent, brooding. And Clara, she was distracted, almost frightened. I assumed it was Ashe's cruelty, but perhaps she suspected more. Suspected what? That something was brewing. She looked at each of us as if weighing our tempers. You should ask her what she saw. I will, I said, standing. One last thing. When the fork went missing, did anyone notice? She shook her head. Not until Clara mentioned it later. Who inventories flatware at a dinner? I thanked her and left, filing her words away. Charles restless, Vincent brooding, Clara anxious. It was a neat little tableau, but one with too many open curtains. Vincent Yarrow's address was next, a penthouse that screamed old money with new insecurities. He answered in a silk dressing gown, drink in hand, hair carefully mussed, the kind of look you buy from a stylist. Ah, Wolfe's man, he said, smiling too broadly. Come in, come in. I've been expecting someone. That makes one of us, I said. Mind if we talk about forks? Forks, yes. Nasty business. Leonard still lives, which is a shame. Not because I wish him dead, you understand, but because surviving feeds his sense of invincibility. He'll dine out on the tail for years, unless someone serves him a second course, I said. Yarrow chuckled. Had a touche. You think one of us tried to finish him? Please. If I wished him dead, I'd hire a professional. We are collectors, not killers. Collectors sometimes get desperate, I said, especially if their reputations are on the line. His smile thinned. Ashe insulted me, yes. He called my collection the indulgence of a bored child. He humiliated me in front of colleagues. But humiliation alone doesn't breed violence. I retaliate with acquisitions, not weapons. Did you see anything unusual that night? Charles Lentz. He's a peculiar fellow, jumpy, obsessed with the chalice. He muttered that Ashe had no right to oversee it. Madeline tried to calm him, but he was favored. And Clara, she was gracious, as always, but nervous. Perhaps she knew the evening would erupt. Ashe was spoiling for conflict, and he found it. Still, he sipped his drink, eyes glittering. The fork was personal. Only someone who knew Clara well enough would choose it. Someone wanted her implicated. That was a thought worth carrying. I left him to his silken spirits and headed to the last name on the list, Charles Lentz. Lentz lived in a narrow walk-up that smelled of dust and varnish. He answered the door with wary eyes behind thick glasses. His hands were stained with something dark, maybe varnish, maybe something worse. Yes? He asked. Archie Goodwin. Wolfe sent me. His mouth twitched. Clara! She came to Wolfe about the fork. He shuddered. The fork. They think it was me. I know they do. Was it? His eyes flared. No. I hated Ashe, yes, but I'm not a fool. To stab him with a fork? That's theater, not murder. I restore, I preserve. I don't destroy. Plenty of restorers scrape away layers to get to what's underneath, I said. His hands clenched. You mock me, fine, I'll tell you. That night Ashe provoked me beyond reason. I left the table twice to breathe, to keep from striking him. If I had done it, I would have used a scalpel, not a fork. The fork was grotesque. Who do you think did it? I asked. He swallowed, voice low. Vincent, or Madeline. Both had reasons. Both had tempers. Clara is too careful. Unless, he stopped. Unless what? He shook his head. No, I won't say it. You'll twist it. I let it drop for now. His nerves were raw, but raw nerves sometimes bleed truth. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my report with eyes closed, fingers steepled. When I finished, he opened them and let out a breath like a man tasting sour wine. Archie, they are all lying. Each one. Not grossly, but by omission. That is always the way. Bring me their words, and I shall find the seam. And what about Clara? I asked. Clara. She's not our client for truth, Archie. She is our client for vindication. The distinction matters. You will watch her closely. Watch her? Yes, someone tampered not with Ash's flesh, but with symbols. Fork, dinner, reputation. That is artistry. And artistry often begins at home. I leaned back, letting that settle. Wolfe had just shifted the ground. The suspects weren't only Ash's enemies. They might also be Clara's. The fork lay on his desk, gleaming dully in the lamplight. In that moment, it looked less like a utensil and more like a conductor's baton waiting for Wolfe to orchestrate the next movement. Wolfe didn't move for a long stretch after I'd given my report. That wasn't unusual. The man could sit in silence so thick, it made you want to check your pulse to be sure you hadn't stopped existing. The fork glinted on the desk between us, like an uninvited guest that wouldn't take the hint. Finally he sighed, deep and resonant, and opened his eyes. Archie, he said, it is clear to me this affair is not what it purports to be. You have done well gathering impressions, but impressions are the froth on broth. They must be skimmed to reach the substance. Sure, I said, but substance doesn't stab a man. People do. So far they're all waving motive around like banners, but nobody's waving a fork. His mouth tightened, which for Wolfe is as close as you'll get to a smile. Precisely. Each person offered you a version designed to distance themselves while pointing toward another. That is not evidence but choreography. Someone is arranging the dance, and your money's on who's leading the band. Patience. He lifted one finger. First, we must establish the symbolic framework. The fork was not chosen at random, nor merely for convenience. It was Clara Vardis's fork. Whoever wielded it intended to bind her to the deed, either as culprit, accomplice, or scapegoat. I leaned back. So our client is either guilty, framed, or both. That narrows it down to everything. Do not debase the exercise with cynicism. The critical question is this. Why deliver the fork to her afterward? To threaten, to taunt, to test her loyalty, or to scare her into hiring you? That got his eyes on me, sharp and still. Yes, that possibility cannot be discounted. Whoever sent it may wish me entangled, either to expose me to danger or to use me to untangle a snarl they cannot resolve themselves. That is why we proceed cautiously. He reached for the bell cord and gave it a short tug. Fritz arrived with the kind of speed that suggested he'd been hovering. Wolfe requested beer, which meant he'd decided to think out loud. Once the frosty bottle was settled within reach, he continued. You will arrange tomorrow to see Miss Vardis again, he said. Without her knowledge of your purpose, you will observe her movements, her correspondences, her associations. She has told us what she wished us to hear. We must know what she refrained from telling. I knew what that meant, tailing. Not glamorous, but necessary. Wolfe didn't believe in walking more than 10 steps if he could help it, but he had no problem sending me to wear out shoe leather. The next morning, I set up outside Clara's building on 83rd Street, coffee in hand and eyes on the door. She emerged around 10, dressed neatly, carrying a leather folio. She walked briskly east, hailed a cab, and I followed in another. The cab let her out near the museum, which was no surprise. She didn't go in, though. She entered a cafe across the street. Through the window I saw her meet someone, Madeline Shore. That was interesting. They sat close, heads bent together. Clara speaking with sharp gestures, Madeline listening intently. After 20 minutes they left together, crossed to the museum and disappeared inside. I lingered outside, weighing options. Going in would spook them, but waiting might lose them. I compromised by drifting into the museum's lobby, where I could watch the main entrance. An hour later they emerged, joined by Charles Lentz. The three of them moved like conspirators who hadn't agreed on the plan yet. Clara nervous, Madeline brisk, Lentz twitchy. They split up at the corner. Clara walked north, Madeline west, Lentz east. I chose Clara. She returned to her building, disappeared inside, and didn't emerge again. When I reported back that evening, Wolfe listened in silence. He sipped beer, eyelids lowered, absorbing every word. When I finished, he exhaled through his nose. So, Clara meets with Madeline. They confer, then consult with Lentz. That suggests coordination, at least on the surface. Or just mutual suspicion, I said. Maybe they all wanted to compare notes without Vincent in the room. Wolfe's lips twitched. No, that is too benign. They are bound together in some enterprise, whether overt or covert. The chalice, I frowned. The museum piece? Yes, you mentioned it was the pretext for the dinner. Clara, Madeline, Lentz, each tied to the museum. Yarrow is the outlier, the benefactor. Ash was the obstacle. He derided them, controlled them, humiliated them. Remove Ash, and their circle tightens. The chalice may be at the center. I considered that. A Byzantine chalice, worth enough to make anyone's eyes gleam. If Ash had power over it, that might explain more than bruised egos. What's the next step? I asked. Saul, Wolfe said simply. That meant Saul Panzer, the best freelance sleuth in town and one of the few Wolfe trusted. When Saul's on the case, the ground gets covered that even I can't always reach. Wolfe dictated instructions. Saul was to investigate the chalice, its provenance, its value, and any irregularities tied to it. Meanwhile, I was to maintain a close watch on Clara. Wolfe wanted not just her movements, but her state of mind. He suspected she was playing two games at once, client to Wolfe, partner to someone else. The following day, Clara gave me more than enough to work with. She left her apartment mid-afternoon alone and headed not to the museum but to a quiet side street near Gramercy. She entered a narrow building with no sign except a discreet plaque, Law Offices of Merriweather and Kane. I waited outside, chewing on that. Lawyers meant paperwork, disputes, maybe wills or ownership claims. When she emerged 40 minutes later, her expression was tight, lips pressed thin. She walked fast, almost running, straight back to her apartment. By the time I reported to Wolfe, Saul had already called in. The chalice, it turned out, was no ordinary relic. It had been acquired from a private European collector, whose title to it was questionable. Rumors suggested it had been removed from a monastery under dubious circumstances. If true, the Calder Museum's acquisition was tainted. Worse, a legal challenge could strip the museum not only of the chalice but of reputation and funding. Wolfe's eyes gleamed, a sure sign he was circling the heart of the matter. So the chalice is compromised. Ash knew this, I suspect, and held it over them. He would enjoy such leverage. That makes him more than a nuisance. He was a threat to their ambitions, their security. And Clara seeing lawyers today fits right in, I said. If the chalice's ownership is contested, she'd want counsel. Indeed. But why the fork? Why this grotesque symbolism, this theatrical gesture? Wolfe tapped the arm of his chair. It is not enough to wound Ash. It was necessary to wound him with Clara's property, to place her at the center. That suggests either she is guilty and careless or innocent and being framed. And which way are you leaning? He closed his eyes. Both. She may have been involved, willingly or not. That is the riddle. The fork was mailed to her deliberately. She brought it to us. If she were guilty, that is perilously bold. If she were innocent, that is desperation. Or, I said, she's guilty but wants you to clear her by blaming someone else. He opened his eyes. Precisely. That, Archie, is why we must press forward. Tomorrow I shall require them all here. I raised an eyebrow. All of them? That's early, isn't it? Usually you don't call the orchestra until you've already written the score. Wolfe allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Sometimes, Archie, one must tune the instruments before the performance. They will come, and when they are assembled I shall listen, not to what they say, but to what they evade, That was my marching order. I spent the next morning calling Clara, Madeline, Vincent, and Charles, delivering the summons in my best confident tone. They all agreed, some reluctantly, some with curiosity. Ash was another matter. When I phoned, he barked that he had no time for Wolfe's games. I pressed, using Wolfe's name like a crowbar, and eventually he growled that he'd come, if only to expose the others for what they were. That evening the brownstone felt charged, as if the orchids upstairs had scented the air with suspicion. Fritz laid out extra chairs in the office. Wolfe settled behind his desk like a monarch awaiting tribute, and I prepared for the parade. The first to arrive was Clara, pale but composed. Madeline followed, brisk and unsmiling. Vincent swept in third, silk scarf knotted carelessly, his smile brittle. Charles trailed last, nervous, wringing his hands. Finally, Leonard Ash stormed in, sling and all, his presence souring the air like vinegar. Wolfe regarded them in silence, his eyes half closed. The fork rested on the desk before him, gleaming dully under the lamp. No one spoke at first. The air grew thick, the way it always does before Wolfe begins his work. When he finally did, his voice was calm, heavy, inexorable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you have been invited not because of what you did or did not do 3 weeks ago, but because of what you will reveal tonight." Archie closed the door. I did, and the click echoed like the first move in a game already underway. The door's click was like a starter pistol, though nobody moved. Wolfe sat massive and unmoving behind the desk, the fork gleaming in front of him as if it were some holy relic. I leaned against the wall, ready to step in if tempers flared. But Wolfe didn't intend to let tempers lead. He let the silence stretch until the room itself began to creak under the weight of it. Madeline shifted in her chair. Vincent fiddled with his scarf. Charles stared at the carpet. Clara folded her hands so tightly her knuckles showed white. And Ash naturally snorted in contempt. Wolfe's eyelids lifted at last. "We are not here to replay the vulgar incident of Mr. Ash's stabbing. We are here to consider what that incident signifies. Each of you has already rehearsed accounts for the police, and again for Mr. Goodwin. I do not expect you to alter them in my presence. Instead, I will require candor in your silences." Vincent gave a thin laugh. "That's quite the riddle, Wolfe. You want us to be honest by keeping our mouths shut. Phooey. Your words will be as ornamental as your neckwear. What you avoid, what you deny, what you leave unsaid, those are the meat. Now, Mr. Ash." Wolfe's eyes shifted, heavy and deliberate. "Your assailant chose not to kill you. That was purposeful. A knife would have sufficed. A fork, however, is a tool of consumption. You are alive yet diminished. Does that not strike you as apt?" Ash's mouth twisted. "I know exactly what you're implying. That one of these parasites sought to humiliate me. Well, they failed. I am very much alive, and none of them has the gall to finish what they started." "On the contrary," Wolfe murmured, "they have gall aplenty. That is not the question. The question is intent. The fork was Clara Vardis's. That implicates her directly. Yet the weapon was then mailed to her neatly wrapped. A curious gesture, no?" Clara's voice was tight. "I told you. Whoever did this wants me ruined. They want suspicion turned on me." "Yes," Wolfe agreed, "but why mail the fork instead of discarding it? Why risk the chain of custody?" "Because the sender wished to ensure you felt the weight of it. They wished you to panic. You did. You brought it here. That was their expectation." Madeline bristled. "Are you saying Clara's the culprit or the victim?" "I am saying she is both the hinge and the door." Wolfe closed his eyes a moment, then reopened them. "Now, let us examine the chalice." That got a reaction. Vincent's brows shot up, Madeline's jaw tightened, Charles's head jerked like he'd been jolted. Even Clara stiffened. Only Ash remained unfazed, though his eyes narrowed as though enjoying the discomfort of the others. "Yes," Wolfe said, savouring the shift in the room. "The Byzantine chalice, acquired dubiously with questions regarding ownership." "Mr. Ash, you knew this, did you not?" Ash's smirk returned. "Of course I did, and I enjoyed every moment of watching them squirm. They were desperate to keep it buried. I made sure they understood who held the strings." "Indeed. And that is why you were attacked. Not to kill you, but to silence your tongue by wounding your pride. Yet pride bleeds less easily than flesh. You have continued to boast," Charles blurted out. "He threatened to ruin us, to expose the acquisition, destroy the museum's standing. He deserved worse than a fork." That got him a round of stares, but he crumpled under them, rubbing his hands. I didn't mean I did it. I mean someone might have anyone. Anyone among four," Wolfe said softly. "But the choice of the fork is peculiar. If Miss Vardis wished to strike, would she not choose a subtler weapon? If Mr. Lentz, would he not use a restorer's tool, a scalpel? If Miss Shaw, would she not prefer the drama of paint or solvent? And if Mr. Yarrow, would he not hire someone with professional efficiency? The fork speaks of intimacy, of proximity, of a desire to humiliate with the ordinary." Madeline crossed her arms. "You make it sound as though the fork itself chose." "No," Wolfe corrected, "but the one who chose it intended to brand the act. They sought not merely to harm Ash, but to embroil Clara." Vincent tilted his head. "Then perhaps the answer is simple. Clara herself did it, then feigned innocence by producing the fork as evidence." "Convenient," Wolfe murmured. "But if she were the assailant, why surrender the instrument to me, knowing it would invite scrutiny? No, too reckless, unless she trusted that scrutiny would lead elsewhere." All eyes turned to Clara, who flushed but held her ground. "I didn't stab him. I swear it. I was horrified when I found the fork in that package. I wanted only to clear myself. That's why I came here. Perhaps, Wolfe said. His eyes shifted to Ash. And you, sir? Did you recognize the hand that delivered your humiliation? Ash barked a laugh. If I did, I'd have handled it myself. No, Wolfe. I have the pleasure of knowing they all wished me harm, but none had the courage to finish it. That is my victory. Victory. Wolfe's tone was dry. You bear the wound, yet you call it triumph? Of course. They tried and failed. That means I won. Wolfe shut his eyes, signaling the end of his engagement. Archie, remove them. I have no more use for their babble tonight. That was my cue. I herded them out one by one, enduring Vincent's smirk, Madeline's glare, Charles's muttering, and Clara's look of frightened gratitude. Ash left last, grumbling about wasted time. When the door closed behind them, I turned to Wolfe. That was quick. You barely poked them. I poked enough, he said. Now we wait. For what? For the next move. Someone will make it. They are cornered beasts. Beasts in desperation act rashly. Our task is to be ready. It turned out Wolfe didn't have to wait long. The very next morning, Saul Panzer came by with an update. He'd traced the Chalice's acquisition papers and discovered they'd been altered. The original owner's claim had been scrubbed. Someone at the museum had tampered with the documentation. Forgery, Wolfe said when Saul finished. Which of them had access? Clara, Madeline, and Charles, all three, Saul answered. Vincent less so, though money can buy access. But the handwriting in the alterations, he pulled out a photograph. It resembles Clara's notes in the files. That was a jolt. If true, it meant Clara hadn't told us everything. Wolfe's eyes glimmered, heavy-lidded. So Miss Vardis is deeper than she admits. Whether guilty of assault or merely guilty of preservation, she is entwined. I said, which means either she's the one with the fork in hand, or she's covering for whoever was. Precisely. Tonight, Archie, you will pay her a visit. Do not confront her, observe. If she is concealing guilt, it will seep out. If she is concealing loyalty to another, that will emerge. I didn't have to wait until night. That afternoon, while shadowing Clara again, I saw her slip into a side street and meet with none other than Vincent Yarrow. They spoke urgently, close together. Vincent handed her an envelope. She tucked it quickly into her folio. They separated with hardly a glance. Back at the brownstone, I reported, and Wolfe's chair groaned as he leaned back, satisfied. So Yarrow supplies funds, Clara supplies alterations. A pact, but what of the fork? That's the sticking point, I said. If they're partners, why would one frame the other? Because partnership is brittle when treasure and reputation are at stake. Betrayal is always the shadow. Wolfe closed his eyes. We must tighten the noose. Tomorrow evening, Archie, summon them all again. This time I will conduct. The fork still sat on the desk, but now it looked less like a weapon and more like a pointer, directing Wolfe toward the revelation waiting at the end of the game. When Wolfe announced he wanted the whole cast back for another performance, I didn't argue. He had that tone, the one that meant he'd already set the table and I was just expected to bring in the guests. My job the next morning was a string of calls and a few personal visits to make sure no one slipped the net. Yarrow was easy. He practically purred when I told him Wolfe required his presence. Madeline grumbled, Clara hesitated, Charles nearly bolted, and Ash barked like a dog chained too long, but in the end, they all agreed. Curiosity, fear, arrogance, whatever it was, it pulled them in. That evening the brownstone had the air of a courtroom waiting for the judge. Fritz had polished the silver and arranged the chairs in Wolfe's office just so, though he made it plain he disapproved of entertaining people who didn't deserve Fritz's brand of civility. Wolfe sat already installed, monumental behind his desk, lips pursed and eyes closed, a portrait of patience. The fork sat in its box on the desk, waiting like evidence entered into the record. The guests filed in one by one. Clara looked pale, worn down by days of tension, her eyes darting as though searching for an escape route. Madeline carried herself briskly, chin high, daring anyone to question her composure. Vincent floated in with his silk scarf and an almost smug confidence, as if tonight were theatre and he had front-row seats. Charles stumbled last, nervous and twitchy, his hands betraying him with constant motion. Ash entered late, swaggering despite his sling, his presence curdling the atmosphere. Wolfe did not open his eyes until they were all seated. Then he leaned back, exhaled heavily, and spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, you return here not by chance but by necessity. The truth of your entanglement has grown tedious. Tonight we shall strip it of concealment. Vincent chuckled lightly. You make it sound like a sermon, Wolfe. Shall we confess our sins? Pfui, Wolfe said, opening his eyes at last. Confession is for priests. Here we deal in facts, stripped of embroidery. Archie, you will record. I took my pad ready. Wolfe gestured lazily at the fork. The assault on Mr. Ashe was not random. It was a performance. The weapon, a fork belonging to Miss Vardis, was a choice calculated to humiliate both victim and owner. Mr. Ashe was not killed because death was not the purpose. The purpose was demonstration. Clara flinched. Madeline crossed her arms. Vincent smirked. Charles muttered something inaudible. Wolfe's gaze settled on Ashe. You, sir, taunted them with knowledge of the chalice's dubious provenance. You intended to hold it over them. The assault silenced you only briefly, but its symbolism was clear. You devour reputations, egos, and positions, so they fed you humiliation. Ashe's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Wolfe turned his gaze on the rest. The chalice is the heart of this matter. Its acquisition was tainted. The documents were altered. Forgery, clumsy yet effective. Saul Panzer traced the hand. It was yours, Miss Vardis, Clara gasped, her face draining of color. No, Mr. Wolfe, I only— Silence, Wolfe commanded, his tone booming. You sought to preserve the museum's prestige, perhaps under pressure from others, but the forgery tied you irrevocably to the scandal. That is why the fork was sent to you, because whoever attacked Ashe wished you implicated, silenced, or desperate. And desperate you were when you came to me. Madeline leaned forward, sharp-eyed. So you're saying Clara forged documents, but that doesn't prove she stabbed Leonard? No, Wolfe agreed calmly. But it proves motive for concealment. Now, Mr. Yarrow, his eyes moved to Vincent. You supplied funds, did you not? You and Miss Vardis were seen in clandestine conference. An envelope was exchanged. Vincent's smile faltered. She needed legal counsel. I merely helped. Friends help friends. Pfui. You supplied money to cover costs arising from the forgery and its potential exposure. That makes you complicit. If not in the assault, then in the concealment. Your vanity required the chalice to remain in the museum because its prestige burnished your own. Vincent's fingers tightened on his knee, but he said nothing. Wolfe shifted his gaze to Charles, who all but squirmed in his chair. Mr. Lentz, you were restless that night, volatile. You excused yourself, returned agitated. Your temper is suspect, but your hands are the hands of a restorer. If you struck, it would not be with a fork. You spoke of scalpels. You betrayed your temperament, but not the act. Charles exhaled shakily, relief mixed with fear. Wolfe's eyes passed to Madeline. You, Miss Shaw, you resent Ashe bitterly, yet your nature is to confront with words, not gestures. You hurl paint, not steel. You are capable of venom, but not this crude symbolism. Her lips tightened, but she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the assessment without comment. Finally, Wolfe's gaze returned to Clara. We return then to you. The fork was yours. The forgery was yours. You are at the center of this snarl. Yet I do not believe you struck Ashe. You are too precise, too careful. The fork was chosen not by you, but by someone who wished to embroil you. His eyes swung slowly, deliberately back to Vincent. Mr. Yarrow, the room froze. Vincent raised his brows, smile returning like a shield. Me? Wolfe, surely you jest. I wouldn't sully my hands. Indeed, you would not strike with your own hands. But you had motive. The chalice must remain untouched, your prestige intact. You had means, funds to bribe, to conceal. And you had opportunity. Close proximity at the dinner when Clara's cutlery lay at hand. The fork was not random. It was deliberate. You used it because it would point to Clara, the forger, the one already entangled. You sought to bind her fate to yours. If the assault succeeded in silencing Ashe, all well and good. If it failed, suspicion would consume Clara, leaving you untouched. A most convenient calculation. Vincent's smile flickered, faltered, then steadied. That's a fine tale, Wolfe, but you can't prove I held the fork. I do not need to, Wolfe said. Your actions since have proved it. You met with Clara in secrecy, passed her funds, sought to secure her silence. If you were innocent, why such furtive dealings? Why aid her concealment? Because her ruin is your ruin. Clara's eyes widened. Vincent, you— Vincent shot her a glare sharp enough to cut. Careful. That sealed it more than any confession. Wolfe's voice deepened, resonant and final. You may protest, Mr. Yarrow, but your protestations ring hollow. I have no legal duty, but the moral duty is clear. Archie, you will summon Inspector Kramer. He will take it from here. That set Ash off, laughing harshly. Ha, I knew it. Yarrow, you pompous fool. All your money, and you couldn't keep your hands clean. Vincent sprang up, but I was already between him and the door. He glared at me, then at Wolfe, but the fight was gone. Clara sat stunned, Madeline stone-faced, Charles trembling. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes again, signaling the matter finished. Remove them, Archie. I have orchids to attend, I did, escorting them one by one. Vincent fumed, but said nothing further. Clara looked broken, betrayed by the man she thought an ally. Madeline whispered a bitter comment about egos and ruin. Charles fled like a rabbit. Ash left grinning, sling bouncing, savouring vindication more than survival. When the house was quiet again, I returned to Wolfe. He had already reached for his beer. You're satisfied? I asked. He sipped, then set the glass down. Not satisfied, but resolved. Yarrow will face his reckoning. Miss Vardis will endure scrutiny for her forgery, but she will live and the chalice will find its rightful controversy. Mr. Ash will preen. Such is the economy of human folly. Funny economy, I said. Costs everyone more than it pays back, Wolfe grunted. That is always the way. Now, Archie, dinner! I require sustenance, not symbolism. I left him to his chair, the fork boxed away for Kramer. Another case wrapped. Not with handcuffs I applied, but with Wolfe's words winding tighter than steel. Inspector Kramer didn't take long. By the time Fritz had served Wolfe's dinner, roast squab with a sauce so rich you could invest in it, the doorbell rang, and I let in the man himself. Kramer came in like a thunderstorm, stuffed into a rumpled overcoat, chewing his cigar, as if it had offended him personally. He gave me a grunt, then stomped into the office where Wolfe was already waiting, massive and immovable, napkin laid over his vest like a general in council. All right, Wolfe, Kramer growled, planting himself in the red leather chair opposite. Goodwin's call was cryptic, and I don't like cryptic. You say you've got something on the fork job that put Ash in the hospital? Spill. Wolfe dabbed his lips with the napkin and folded his hands. You will find the man you want in Vincent Yarrow. He contrived the attack, wielding Miss Vardis's fork as a weapon of humiliation. His motive, to silence Ash, who threatened to expose the chalice's questionable provenance, and to bind suspicion upon Clara Vardis, whose forgery of acquisition papers would make her the perfect scapegoat. Kramer puffed at his cigar until it glowed, scowling. That's a neat little theory. But where's the proof? I can't slap irons on Yarrow because Nero Wolfe thinks forks are symbolic. Wolfe's eyes half closed, and his voice grew heavier. Proof is the province of your laboratories and witnesses, Inspector. I offer you deduction, the marrow of evidence. Yarrow's clandestine meetings with Vardis, the money he supplied, the deliberate choice of her fork. All these are strands. Together they weave only one pattern, Kramer snorted. Strands and patterns don't hold in court. I need testimony. I need confessions. I need something that bleeds ink, not philosophy. Phooey. Wolfe reached for his beer, took a long pull and set it down with a thump. Then you must apply your resources. Confront Yarrow. He will bluster. Press harder, and he will reveal more. His arrogance is his undoing. Kramer glared, but I could see the twitch at the corner of his mouth. He'd been here enough times to know Wolfe's deductions weren't smoke. And what about the girl, Vardis? If she doctored museum papers, she's in this up to her neck. She is culpable in forgery, yes, Wolfe said, but she is not culpable in assault. She's merely a pawn, used by Yarrow for her access and her hand. Kramer muttered something that sounded like, "We'll see," and shoved himself upright. Fine, I'll talk to Yarrow. But if this blows back, Wolfe, it's your fat neck on the block. Not mine. Indeed, Wolfe murmured, already leaning back, closing his eyes again as though dismissing the matter. When Kramer had stormed out, I lingered by the desk. You're confident Yarrow will crack? Confident? No certain? Yes, Wolfe replied without opening his eyes. His vanity will not withstand interrogation. It never does. The certainty was Wolfe's alone. I'd seen men wriggle out of tighter corners than Vincent Yarrow. Still, I couldn't argue with the weight in Wolfe's tone. He'd already moved on to orchids in his mind. I spent the next day restless, waiting for the phone to ring with news. Around 3 in the afternoon it did. Kramer's voice was loud enough to make me hold the receiver away from my ear. Goodwin. That slick-haired parasite cracked like an egg. We brought him in, questioned him, and the dam broke. He admitted to confronting Ash, admitted to grabbing the fork in a fit, admitted to jabbing him just to shut him up. Claims he never meant to kill, just to wound. And you know what? The idiot bragged about mailing the fork back to Vardis. Thought it was clever. We've got him cold. Congratulations, I said. Though it sounded more like Wolfe had solved it cold, Kramer grunted. Don't get smug. Wolfe's off the hook this time, but I'm still not his errand boy. You tell him the DA will take it from here. And Vardis? We'll have to see. Forgery's another matter, but at least she's not in for attempted murder. I relayed the news to Wolfe in the office. He didn't even open his eyes when I finished. As expected. That's it? I asked. No speech, no lecture, no pat on your own back. He exhaled through his nose. Must I trumpet? The truth is plain. Yarrow's vanity demanded a gesture, Ash's arrogance demanded a target, and Clara's weakness supplied the instrument. The inevitable result was a fork where it ought not be. Maybe so, I said, settling into my chair, but I can't shake the feeling it all wrapped up too neatly. Yarrow admits it, sure, but the others aren't clean either. Madeline with her grudge, Charles with his temper, Clara with her forgery, they all played parts. Life, Wolfe said, is not neat. But conclusions must be. The law will address what it can. The rest will persist as human folly. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. Fritz outdid himself with a soufflé, which put Wolfe in a mood so close to contentment that he almost smiled. I let the case settle in my mind, the pieces clicking into place like stubborn drawers finally closing. Still, there was a tension in the brownstone air that hadn't lifted. Maybe it was Clara's pale face when she'd realized Yarrow had betrayed her. Maybe it was Ash's smirk, already savoring his survival as a personal triumph. Or maybe it was just the fork itself, sealed away but still sharp in memory. Later, while Wolfe took his post-prandial beer and settled into his chair with the air of a mountain unmoved by weather, I asked him the question that had been gnawing at me. Why did you really take the case, Wolfe? You could have let Clara stew in her own broth. What made you bite? His eyelids lifted, and his eyes fixed on me with that weight that always made me feel like I'd walked into a trap I hadn't seen. Archie, a fork is a humble instrument, yet it was made into a weapon of humiliation. That affront to order is intolerable. Dinner is sacrosanct. To pervert its implements for insult, that is an obscenity I could not ignore. I chuckled, shaking my head. So you solved it out of respect for cutlery? For civilization, he corrected, closing his eyes again. And for myself. Now Archie, silence. Words are as vulgar as forks in wounds. The brownstone returned to its rhythm. Orchids upstairs, Fritz in the kitchen, Wolfe in his chair, and me with my notebook. Outside the city roared and clattered, but inside the storm had passed. Yarrow would face justice. Clara would survive her shame. Ash would continue to sneer, and Wolfe would file it all away as another demonstration of human vanity colliding with order. The fork had been used to stab, but in the end it was Wolfe's words that cut deepest. For a few days after Yarrow's arrest, the brownstone settled back into its familiar pace. Wolfe spent his mornings and afternoons with the orchids, muttering sweet nothings to blossoms worth more than some people's yearly salary. Fritz composed meals like a composer with a baton, and I found myself with nothing more demanding than balancing accounts and reading the papers. For once, it seemed, the case had concluded cleanly. Yarrow confessed. Kramer crowed. Wolfe went back to his beer. But neat bows make me suspicious, and I wasn't the only one. Clara called 2 nights later, her voice on the line brittle as glass. Archie, please. I know Vincent confessed, but it doesn't fit. He wasn't impulsive. Everything he did was calculated. To strike Leonard with a fork, it doesn't sound like him. Confession trumps speculation, I said, though her worry had me sitting straighter. He gave Kramer the story himself. Yes, but why? Her breath caught. Vincent never took blame for anything in his life. For him to suddenly admit this, it makes no sense. When I relayed it to Wolfe, he was ensconced in his chair, a book open on his lap, and a half-drained bottle of beer at hand. He listened without looking up. She is not wrong, he said finally. Yarrow's vanity would not permit confession without purpose. He may have admitted to the act, But whether the act was his is another matter. That was Wolfe, just when you thought he was content to let the law do the mopping up. He pulled the rug and showed you the stain underneath. I asked him, "So you think Yarrow took the fall for someone?" Wolfe shut the book, his eyes on me now. Not altruistically. He is incapable of self-sacrifice. If he confessed, it was to protect an asset, preserve leverage or ensure silence in another quarter, meaning Clara's not out of the woods, meaning none of them are. Wolfe tapped his fingers together. "Archie, you will see Yarrow in custody. Observe him. Press him. He may reveal who benefits from his admission." Kramer wasn't thrilled to let me near his shiny new prisoner, but Wolfe's name carried enough weight to grind down resistance. Yarrow looked different in a cell, still wearing silk, still keeping his hair just so, but the confidence had a crack in it. He greeted me with a smile that was more grimace than charm. "So Wolfe sent his secretary to gloat?" He said, "Call me secretary again, and I'll recommend they give you a spoon for dinner instead of a fork," I told him, pulling up a chair. "I'm here to ask why you confessed." "Because I did it." "Try again." His eyes narrowed. "What difference does it make? Ash isn't dead. The law has its culprit. Wolfe has his triumph. The museum keeps its chalice for now. Everyone gets what they want. Not everyone. Clara's still dangling. She says you'd never admit a thing if it was true." I'm inclined to agree. Something flickered in his eyes. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Tell Wolfe this. Sometimes the appearance of guilt is more valuable than innocence. If the right people believe I struck, then certain matters remain untouched, such as—" He leaned back, smile sliding into place again. "If Wolfe is as clever as you claim, he already knows." That was all he gave me. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened while I repeated every word. He sat in silence, his lips compressed, then muttered, "Imbecile. He thinks himself a strategist, yet his vanity betrays him. He conceals not himself but another." "Who?" I asked. "Miss Vardis," Wolfe said heavily. "He protects her, not from the fork, but from the chalice. If her forgery is fully exposed, the museum collapses and with it his prestige. He would rather claim an assault than lose the chalice's shine." "Then we've got a problem," I said. "Because if Kramer's happy with Yarrow in a cell, nobody's going to dig deeper." "Then we must dig," Wolfe replied. "Bring Clara here tomorrow." "I shall compel candor." Clara came pale and hesitant, her nerves stretched thin. Wolfe regarded her as a hawk might a trembling sparrow. "Miss Vardis, you are guilty of forgery." "That is fact. But tell me, did you know Yarrow would confess to the assault?" Her eyes widened. "He confessed." "Voluntarily?" "Do not dissemble." "He has admitted." "Did you arrange it?" "No." She clasped her hands together. "I never asked him to. Vincent was ambitious, arrogant, but he wouldn't do something so crude. If he confessed, it wasn't for me." "Not for you," Wolfe echoed. "For himself, then. To preserve his reputation by preventing the chalice's scandal from coming to light. Yet you are bound inextricably to that scandal. He thought to protect you as well, but only insofar as it protected him." Tears welled, but she held them back with a sharp inhale. "If the chalice is exposed, I'll be ruined." "But I swear I didn't stab Leonard." "I couldn't, perhaps," Wolfe said, "but your forgery is the true wound here. The fork is theatre. The chalice is substance. She left soon after, shaken and subdued." Wolfe summoned me back into the office with a flick of his fingers. "Archie, we have reached the marrow. Yarrow's confession is a veil. The true peril lies with the chalice. That artifact is a theft twice over. First from the monastery, then from the truth. Expose that, and you will reveal who most feared Ash's tongue." "And that's who shoved a fork into him," I said. "Precisely." The next day was a whirl of legwork. Wolfe sent Saul to dig further into the chalice's history, while I tracked down Madeline and Charles. Madeline, cornered in her studio, finally admitted Ash had threatened her career with public exposure of the chalice's origin. If he'd spoken, the museum's reputation would have burned. I would have lost commissions for years. I hated him for it, but I didn't stab him. Charles, found hunched over a restoration project, broke down near tears. He mocked me, called me a parasite. I wanted to hurt him, yes, but the fork, I couldn't. I swear I couldn't. Each denial carried the ring of truth twisted with fear. They hadn't done it, but they had wanted to. That left Wolfe's theory intact. Yarrow's confession covered more than his vanity. It covered the museum itself, and by extension, all of them. That night, Wolfe convened me in the office. Saul had returned with final confirmation. The chalice had indeed been stolen, smuggled out of its monastery, sold through a shadow market. The museum's acquisition was rotten at the core. Ash had learned this, and that knowledge made him dangerous. Wolfe leaned back, eyes shut, his voice low and firm. "Archie, the truth is this. Any of them might have stabbed Ash. All had reason, all had access. But only one had the audacity to twist a dinner fork into a weapon of humiliation. That audacity belongs not to Yarrow, vain though he is, but to Madeline Shaw." I straightened. "Madeline?" She said herself she'd use paint, not steel. Words, Archie. Her denial was too glib. She is the only one with temperament for drama, with instinct for gesture. The fork was a performance, meant to mock Ash as he mocked her art. She relied on Clara's forgery to shield her. Yarrow's confession is her curtain, but curtains can be pulled. It hit me then. The cafe meeting I'd seen between Clara and Madeline before Lentz joined them. Madeline had been whispering, her expression fierce, Clara frightened. Madeline had steered the narrative while Yarrow later played his part. "So what's the move?" I asked. Wolfe's lips curved faintly. "Tomorrow we summon them all once more. The performance will end, and the fork shall point true." The following evening the brownstone was once again prepared for company, though Fritz did so with the same air a surgeon might wear when scrubbing in for a distasteful operation. Wolfe remained in his chair, eyes half-lidded, while I made the rounds of calls and ensured every one of the suspects would show. None refused. Curiosity, fear, vanity, those were ropes that pulled as tight as subpoenas. They arrived as before, one by one, each trailing their own cloud of suspicion. Clara came first, looking drained, her folio clutched like a shield. Vincent followed, released under guard only to sit again in Wolfe's office, his smugness diminished but not extinguished. Charles shuffled in after, twitchy and pale, muttering under his breath as though rehearsing alibis. And last came Madeline, brisk, chin high, eyes sharp with challenge. Ash wasn't summoned this time. Wolfe had declared him a distraction rather than a necessity. When they were seated, Wolfe stirred. He looked every inch the presiding magistrate, with the fork on the desk before him like an exhibit under glass. His voice was low but heavy, and it filled the room. "So you return here because the truth remains unfinished. Mr. Yarrow has confessed, yes, but his confession was a veil. We will now strip it aside." Vincent bristled. "I already admitted to it. Why drag this out?" "Because," Wolfe said, his eyes fastening on him, "your confession was not truth but convenience. You admitted to preserve the chalice's reputation, to protect your investment, and perhaps to shield another. But you did not wield the fork. That is certain." Vincent's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Wolfe turned his gaze slowly across the others, stopping at Madeline. "You, Miss Shaw," struck Ash. "You with a fork plucked from Clara's table. You, with a dramatist's instinct, transformed a domestic utensil into an emblem of humiliation. You who despised Ash's mockery of your art, chose to answer mockery with theatre." The silence was absolute. Clara's breath caught, Charles stilled. Vincent leaned forward as if to savor the moment. Madeline, though, did not flinch. She held Wolfe's gaze, her expression unreadable. "That's absurd," she said finally, voice even. "You said yourself I prefer words to weapons." "I said you declared so," Wolfe corrected, his tone precise. "But your declaration was a mask. Consider the gesture. The fork not meant to kill but to shame. That is not brutish violence. That is performance. And who among you traffics in performance more than you?" Madeline's eyes flashed. "You mistake artistic temperament for violence. I hated Ash, yes. We all did. But hatred is not proof. Phooey. Hatred is not proof, but choice is. The fork was Clara's. That ensured suspicion fell upon her, already compromised by forgery. Yarrow's confession, too pat, too willing, was the second shield you hid behind. But the essence of the gesture, the need to humiliate through symbolism, is yours. You struck him not to silence, but to mark him. That is the artist's touch." Charles burst out suddenly, voice cracking. "I knew it. I saw you slip something into your bag that night. I thought it was just a napkin, but—" Madeline whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing. "You little coward!" "You'll say anything to save yourself." Charles shrank back, but Wolfe lifted a hand, silencing the room. "Enough. Your outburst only confirms what was already apparent. Miss Shaw, your drama betrays you. You cannot abide the thought of silence. Even now you perform." Madeline's control cracked just for a heartbeat. Her lips curled, a grimace more than a smile. If I did it, she said softly, it was justice. He deserved worse than a fork, Clara gasped. Vincent let out a low whistle and Charles muttered a prayer. I stepped closer, ready to intervene, but Wolfe didn't move. He only inclined his head slightly, as if accepting a confession carved from air. There, he said. The admission of spirit, if not of words. That is sufficient, Madeline shot to her feet. You think you can hand me over to Kramer with this? He'll laugh you out of his office. Symbolism and supposition won't hold up. No, Wolfe agreed calmly, but your temper will. Already you unravel. You could not resist revealing yourself. Inspector Kramer will supply the ink for the record. Archie, call him. I moved to the phone, but Madeline's voice cut across the room. Stop, you want the truth? I'll give it. Yes, I stabbed him. Not to kill, but to brand him. He spent years branding others with ridicule, with contempt. I wanted him marked, so I used a fork. Common, ordinary, degrading. Let him live with that scar. Clara buried her face in her hands. Vincent shook his head slowly, lips curling in amusement. Charles sat frozen. Wolfe simply closed his eyes. When Kramer arrived 20 minutes later, cigar smoke preceding him like a herald, I had the pleasure of relaying the confession. He wasn't amused. You mean to tell me she stuck Ash with a fork because she thought it was poetic? That is the essence, Wolfe said without opening his eyes. Kramer muttered something unprintable, then hauled Madeline to her feet. She didn't resist. She even smirked, tossing her hair back as if she were taking a bow. History will remember Leonard Ash as the man stabbed with a fork, she said. And that's more than he deserved. More than he deserved. When the door closed behind them, the office sagged with silence. Clara lifted her head, eyes red. It's over? For you, yes, Wolfe said. You will still answer for the forgery, but you are free of the assault. Yarrow will face his own reckoning for deception. Mr. Lentz, he paused, opening his eyes to glance at Charles, will continue to tremble. Such is life, Charles nodded meekly, eager to escape. Vincent rose, smoothing his scarf, smirking again. Well, Wolfe, you've put on quite the play yourself, bravo. He left with a flourish, leaving Clara to stumble out last, murmuring her thanks. When the house was empty, I turned to Wolfe. Neat finish, though I'll admit. Watching her confess out of sheer pride was a twist I didn't see coming. Wolfe grunted. Pride is the most reliable lever. Apply pressure, and it will lift the heaviest deceit. And what about Ash? You think he'll ever learn anything from all this? Wolfe opened his eyes, fixing me with a look both weary and sharp. He will learn nothing. Men like Ash do not learn. They persist, as do weeds. But the lesson is not for him. It is for us, that human vanity will pervert even the instruments of nourishment into tools of humiliation. He reached for his beer, took a deliberate swallow, and let out a long breath. Now, Archie, enough. The case is concluded. Dinner is waiting. As I followed him out, I glanced once more at the fork in its box, waiting to be handed over to Kramer. It looked dull now, almost ordinary again. But I knew better. It had cut more than flesh. It had carved open egos, ambitions, and schemes, leaving scars sharper than its tines. When the door closed on Madeline and Kramer, I expected Wolfe to release a sigh of relief, the kind that meant the case had concluded and the brownstone could return to its natural state, quiet, orderly, and smelling faintly of Fritz's stockpots. Instead, Wolfe stayed seated in his chair, eyes still open, a rare thing after the climax of a case. He wasn't basking in triumph. He was staring at the empty chair where Madeline had been, as though the ghost of her smirk still lingered. I broke the silence. You've wrapped it. Madeline confessed. Kramer's got her. Yarrow's still locked up for obstruction. Clara's free to patch her life back together. And Charles is probably halfway home to crawl under his bed. Why aren't you reaching for the beer and orchids? Wolfe's lips pressed tight. Because, Archie, resolution is not restoration. This affair leaves a residue. Residue? I asked, dropping into my chair. You mean the chalice mess? Precisely. The chalice is still in the Calder Museum, still tainted, still acquired under dubious circumstances. Miss Vardis's forgery remains a matter of record. The museum's integrity has already suffered. Madeline's dramatics only exposed what was festering underneath. Ash may survive his scar, but the institution may not. Then that's their problem, I said. We solved the fork stabbing. Kramer's got his collar. We don't usually go around disinfecting cultural relics. Perhaps not, Wolfe admitted. But the chalice was the heart of the affair. Its corruption bled into each of them. Vardis's forgery, Yarrow's vanity, Shaw's rage, Lentz's insecurities, Ash's arrogance. Remove the chalice and the assault never happens. It is the object that poisoned them. That was Wolfe. Even after a case, he couldn't leave the intellectual marrow untouched. He saw the chalice not as an artifact, but as a festering wound in the middle of the city's cultural body. I knew then I wasn't getting him off it with casual chatter. The next morning brought the newspaper, and with it front-page drama. Madeleine Shaw's arrest was splashed across the columns, complete with grainy photographs of her being escorted by Kramer's men, chin high as if she were posing for a portrait instead of heading for a cell. The press loved the symbolism. Acclaimed artist turns fork into weapon. Leonard Ash, never one to waste an opportunity, gave interviews from his townhouse, sleeve rolled up to display the scar like a badge of honor. He called it proof of his resilience and a reminder that brilliance breeds jealousy. I tossed the paper onto Wolfe's desk. There you go. Ash turned a stabbing into a publicity stunt. If he had half a conscience, he'd thank Madeleine for boosting his brand, Wolfe grunted. He was already thumbing through the art section for news of the chalice. Sure enough, buried on page 10, there was a small piece about questions of provenance surrounding the Byzantine artifact. A few scholars had started sniffing around, emboldened by the scandal. There, Wolfe murmured, tapping the page with one thick finger. The wound festers. The chalice will be the next scandal, and Miss Vardis will be summoned to answer for her forgery. That afternoon, Clara appeared at the door without calling first. She looked even more strained than before, dark circles under her eyes. Fritz let her in with reluctance, and she perched in the client chair like a sparrow in a storm. "Mr. Wolfe, it isn't over," she said. "The museum board is meeting. They want a scapegoat. They'll point to me. Yarrow won't protect me now, and with Madeleine confessing, everything's unraveling. I'll be ruined." Wolfe regarded her without sympathy. "You forged documents. You compromised your integrity. You were complicit in deception. That you are exposed is no injustice." She winced but pressed on. "But I didn't stab Leonard. And if the museum collapses, my career ends. I beg you, please, is there anything you can do?" Wolfe closed his eyes, fingers steepled. For a long minute he said nothing. Then, slowly, he spoke. "Your salvation lies not in my words, but in disclosure. If you admit your forgery before it is uncovered, you seize control of the narrative. Contrition, honesty, sacrifice, those are currencies institutions respect when scandal threatens their coffers." Her face went white. "You're telling me to confess publicly?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "Better to fall by your own hand than by theirs. They may yet salvage you as a penitent, rather than discard you as a liar." She looked at me then, eyes desperate, but I only shrugged. Wolfe wasn't in the business of hand-holding. He dealt in truth, not sympathy. She left soon after, muttering thanks that sounded more like resignation. That night, Fritz served lamb shanks that could have earned medals. But Wolfe was distant, chewing slowly, eyes somewhere beyond the dining room walls. After dinner, with beer in hand, he finally spoke. "Archie, note this. The fork was a trifle, but it drew blood. The chalice is grand, and it will draw more. Humanity corrupts both the ordinary and the sacred. That is its most consistent failing." "You're getting philosophical again," I said. "Which means the case is really over." "Not philosophy," Wolfe corrected. "Observation. The chalice will topple reputations yet. But it is no longer our affair." And with that he closed the book on it. The following week brought the expected headlines. Madeleine Shaw was indicted. Yarrow faced charges for obstruction and fraud, and Clara Vardis stepped before the museum board with a statement of contrition. She admitted her forgery, framed it as a misguided attempt to protect the museum, and resigned her post. The board accepted with solemn regret, but the press painted her as both villain and victim. Charles Lentz vanished from the gossip columns entirely, returning to his restorations as if nothing had happened. Leonard Ash, meanwhile, rode the wave of scandal to new prominence, giving lectures on art, ego, and survival, with his scar displayed like a relic. Back in the brownstone, life resumed its sacred rhythm. The orchids were tended, the meals were composed, the beer was poured, and the silence was restored. Wolfe had no further interest in the chalice or its fallout. For him, The affair had ended the moment Madeline revealed her pride, and the rest was merely aftermath. One evening, as I sat at my desk catching up on paperwork, Wolfe broke the silence. "Archie, the fork was used not to kill but to humiliate." "That distinction is important," I glanced up. "Sure, it means Ash gets to preen instead of being buried. No, it means the assault was never about him. It was about expression, about reducing a man to the level of utensils, about proving that ego can be pierced by common implements. Miss Shaw achieved her aim even in failure." "Tell that to Kramer," I said. "He's not fond of symbolism." "Kramer is fond of convictions," Wolfe said. "Symbolism is wasted on him, but not on us." The lesson is this: men and women alike wield humiliation more often than knives. A word, a gesture, a forged document. These cut deeper than steel. He reached for his beer, drained it, and set it down with finality. It is the vulgarity of civilization that it turns nourishment into weapons and art into fraud. Dinner, Archie, is sacred. So is truth. When either is debased, consequences follow. He closed his eyes, dismissing the world again, and the brownstone fell into its usual calm. Fritz clattered faintly in the kitchen. The orchids breathed their moist air upstairs, and outside the city continued to grind. The fork had returned to being nothing more than a piece of silver, locked in an evidence room. But in Wolfe's mind and in mine it had done its work. It had stabbed not only flesh but pride, reputation, and vanity. And, like Wolfe said, that was the real wound, the kind that never heals. The weeks that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet Wolfe cherished, and I tried not to disturb. The newspapers gradually lost interest in the fork affair, turning their headlines to fresher scandals. Madeline Shaw's trial was set. Vincent Yarrow's charges mounted. Clara Vardis disappeared from society pages, and Leonard Ash, scar proudly displayed, strutted as though survival itself were a mark of genius. Charles Lentz was forgotten entirely, which suited him fine. Inside the brownstone, the rhythms resumed. Orchids in the morning, beer in the afternoon, dinner in the evening. Wolfe sat more heavily than usual, as if the entire business had left him with an aftertaste he couldn't quite swallow. I finally asked him, one night after Fritz had retired to the kitchen, "What's gnawing at you?" "We won. The case is wrapped. Even Kramer admitted you nailed it." Wolfe opened his eyes, slow and deliberate, and regarded me. "Victory, Archie, is a vulgar word. What we achieved was clarity. Yet clarity itself is unsatisfying when it exposes the debasement of both art and civilization." "You mean the chalice?" "Of course." He shifted slightly in his chair, the leather groaning in sympathy. An artifact venerated for centuries, reduced to an object of vanity, then corrupted by theft and forgery. The chalice drew them together, poisoned them, and birthed humiliation and violence. A dinner fork was merely the crude punctuation. I leaned back. "If that's your conclusion, it's grim enough to give anyone indigestion." He allowed the faintest snort. "It is the truth. Humanity insists on turning nourishment into spectacle, art into property, morality into convenience. Miss Shaw's fork was not simply a weapon. It was a declaration that all their pretensions, Ash's arrogance, Yarrow's vanity, Vardis's duplicity, could be pierced by the most common of utensils. I let that sink in. Wolfe had a way of pulling philosophy out of cutlery that would make a preacher jealous. But I knew him well enough to know he wasn't sermonizing for me. He was sealing the case in his own mind, closing the drawer. "So where does that leave us?" I asked. "Where we always are," he replied. "Here in this house. Safe from the vulgarities outside. Until, of course, the next intrusion arrives at our door. That was Wolfe. No victory lap, no medals, no applause, just a final observation that left the air heavier than before. He closed his eyes, folded his hands across his middle, and retreated into stillness, leaving me to fill the silence. I looked at the empty desk, where the fork had once sat in its box, and couldn't help smiling. They fork, of all things. It had brought them all here, turned their ambitions inside out, and ended with Wolfe delivering a verdict sharper than any blade. The brownstone was quiet again, the way it liked to be, but I knew that quiet wouldn't last. It never did. For now, though, I let it be. Fritz would soon call us to dinner, and Wolfe would rise lumbering toward the table with more dignity than most men carried to their graves. And I'd follow, knowing the world outside would keep on turning forks into weapons and art into fraud, until the next time it landed on our doorstep, because that's how it always went. Wolfe in his chair, me on the street, human folly providing the fuel, and truth the flame, and as always, it ended not with a bang but with dinner.